Dominic Cruz is about to take the stage.
We have a saying we say before every show. It's believe in yourself, believe in the show, and believe in each other.
Dear San Francisco is a love letter to the city in the form of a circus show. It features 9 performers each night, including Dominic and his partner, Maya Kesselman Cruz.
We're both acrobats, but Maya is primarily a flyer, which means that she gets thrown.
In our 9 years of our romantic relationship, we've been working together that entire time.
Maya and Dominic are married, but they say the whole cast feels like family. That sense of closeness helps them rely on each other to do some pretty dangerous moves in front of a live audience.
It is important. The stakes are humongous. I mean, let's say the person who's supposed to catch me doesn't catch me.
For so many aspects of the show, success depends on trust.
You have to trust someone's going to catch you, and you can't react to the fear of maybe not being caught in the right way.
Dominic describes a trick in the show that exemplifies this. It involves something called a two-high, where one performer stands on another's shoulders. This trick involves 2 two-highs combined.
And then we have Maya, my wife, at the top, which can also be considered the most dangerous place.
Dominic is a spotter for this trick. That means his job is to catch the other acrobats if something goes wrong.
You gotta trust us to catch you.
I have to be ready every single night for something to happen, because if something happens and I'm supposed to catch someone and I don't, that's my fault. Wow, even just thinking about it makes me like, it's a lot of emotions, because you're like, I'm out there watching her do something super dangerous. So we're standing in a circle, we're spotting, and she climbs up until she finally gets to the top, and the music crescendos and everyone loses their minds because they're like, I'm looking at 2 people standing on top of one person. It's like so hard. It's one of the hardest tricks we do in the show. And then Maya gets thrown off the 3-high, and me and Eduardo catch her. Every time I'm watching this trick, I'm like, this is so hard, and we do this every night.
Dominic and Maya say the trust depends on the culture and the structures that they have in place, which allows them to perform safely night after night. And if someone breaks that trust, the consequences go beyond the potential life-threatening injuries. It means that person never works in the circus again.
You can't be dependable.
That's dangerous. Immediately, that's dangerous. You're flagged as dangerous. Circus world is very small. It's all over the world, but also a very small world.
It's not just in the circus world where this applies. Anat Admati, a professor of finance and economics at Stanford Graduate School of Business, and co-author of the book The Banker's New Clothes: What's Wrong with Banking and What to Do About It, says trust and trustworthiness are key to any functioning democracy.
The trust ultimately has to be with the government. But the government then, on its part, has to create accountability for all people.
And that's our focus today. How much our democracy depends on trust and the ways that we create it. This is If Then, a podcast from Stanford Graduate School of Business, where we examine research findings that can help us navigate the complex issues facing us in business, leadership, and society. I'm Kevin Kuhl, Senior Editor at Stanford GSB. I want to start our conversation today by talking about trust, or maybe the lack thereof, that has resulted from bad behavior by corporations. We'll talk about the banking sector later on. But let's talk about the social harms that are created when corporations act badly, whether that's Purdue Pharma, whatever that might be.
Yeah, I actually like to always start with the government failure. So I think any failures to society, when people cause harm, when corporations cause harm, who are kind of legal people, when that harm is too much, the problem is the rules and the enforcement of the rules. So to me, when I've started noticing what was wrong with banking after the financial crisis, I was not particularly interested in, talking to Jamie Dimon, CEO of JP Morgan Chase. I was much more focused on the policymakers, on the regulators, on the politicians, because it's there that the answer is. The incentives are just there. And, if the law allows you to do something, well, most people would do it and would even think it's okay to do. Anything that's legal, lawful is okay. In fact, I'm clever, taking advantage of what one can do. So I don't place the problem with the, evil corporations. I placed it with the bad rules and governments allowing themselves to be talked into these rules or to not enforce rules properly. That's where I think the focus should be. So it should be on trustworthy governments. Trustworthy. So they have to be worthy of our trust. And I think the crisis that we have starts from not trusting governments, especially in democratic governments that we're nominally electing.
So let's get into some specifics so folks can understand kind of the context that we're working in here. So when you say government failures, are you talking the failure to regulate? Or are you talking about policies that would even supersede regulations?
You mentioned Purdue, so let's go there. So Purdue Pharma, the basic story is in the 90s came up with this magic drug called OxyContin. And OxyContin was an opioid. The medical profession and the drug administration was very concerned with addiction or addictiveness of opioids. So it was considered a highly addictive drug, and it was under strict regulation.
And Purdue should have known this or did know this.
Purdue definitely knew this, but they had this line that they somehow convinced the Food and Drug Administration to allow them to market with, which was that OxyContin was not as addictive because it was somehow slow release. So here you have a line that, you got this magic drug, and they went on a big campaign to change the perception of pain medication. Everybody needed, 30 days of OxyContin, oxycodone later, generic, for any minor surgery. I still get that from my dentist, and I decline. What they wanted to look away from, and what the FDA allowed them, the Food and Drug Administration in the U.S. allowed them to overlook, is the fact that in the 90s when they started, first that OxyContin was highly subject to misuse. People were breaking it and snorting it and using it as a drug, and it started
selling it off market.
It started being traded off market, and the addictiveness especially. So the addictiveness is such that whatever is the statistics is, but there are a certain percentage of people who after a month of this drug will get addicted to it. And it's just a fact of the property of that it is addictive. And once the people get addicted, then all kinds of things happen. They go back to their doctors asking for more. Doctors feel like they want to satisfy their patients, and they give them. And the company is doing very aggressive marketing of this drug, very aggressive. And books have been written about their methods of marketing.
And the FDA through this just basically looked the other way?
Yeah. The FDA allowed them to do all this stuff, which slipped into bribing doctors, into doctors being tempted to become pill mill doctors in a strip mall and writing out a lot of prescriptions. And then came all kinds of other participants in this, other opioids manufacturers, distributors of the drugs, McKesson, all companies that were at that point running into other laws, drug distribution laws. There were laws saying that if you're providing to a community more medicine or more drugs than they could possibly consume, then you have to report it to the Drug Administration, et cetera, et cetera. And so there is another agency in the government, the DEA, that also failed. And when they ended up dealing with McKesson, which was one of these companies that were distributing opioids, it was a very small slap. So you basically have a whole system of corporations benefiting from poor rules and poor enforcement of rules. Right. And by the end of this, we have a major addiction crisis in the U.S. Catastrophe with immeasurable harm. Lots of people dying.
So there's a lot going on here.
There's a lot
going on. And so let's try and unpack some of this a little bit. So the FDA looks the other way, and we're just going to use this as an example. We're not necessarily picking on the FDA here, but this is a striking example for what we want to talk about today.
You can talk about the FAA with Boeing.
Yeah, so You talked about how either the rules aren't strong enough or they're improperly enforced. So how does this happen? Why does it happen? Is it just sort of inattention, or is it because they're too cozy with the corporations? What's going on?
It's a combination. I mean, what I saw in banking is really a lot of things between confusion. I don't really know what people know or want to know, and a certain symbiotic relations that develop. And I think, in the United States, since we're talking about the United States, or we can talk about other countries, the system equates money, financial resources, with speech and power and influence. And you end up in a lot of situations having people around the table who could be conflicted and themselves feel like they're not accountable personally for that decision, and they have something to gain from looking away or whatever. And so it just ends up being that there's enough of what some political scientists, economists like to call, capture, or regulatory capture, or, a way to distort the rules that plays out. And, it goes all the way to the political system, definitely, where campaign contributions play a big role. So money plays a huge role in our politics in the U.S., and that certainly is a part of it. And, in technical areas where, the public cannot understand how a medicine actually works, or rules about banking. I mean, that
we're relying
was what
on
I
these
first.
people.
And we're relying on experts everywhere. And so the question is, around the room making decisions, are you able to get really impartial, unconflicted experts who will remember the public interest and will act in the public interest? Now, you might have those people, but I have seen the subtle way in which the politics can creep in. For example, the way politicians appoint some of these people, and they will be, either not knowing or not wanting to know the reality of it, or wanting to appoint people. It's a very subtle form of, you might call corruption. It's an abuse of power, and it's basically a betrayal of trust, because we trust. You started with trust. And so we might trust somebody who's not trustworthy. So that's why I like to talk about trustworthiness.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, who should you trust? Who deserves our trust? And to deserve a trust, somebody needs to actually not harm us even if they can get away with it. We need to trust.
Or not betray the faith that is implicit in, for example, a regulatory agency not allowing an addictive drug to get into the mainstream of the society.
And especially as it becomes clear that it's addictive, really stepping in, much earlier and starting to control the way it's distributed between it and other agencies, getting on it a lot before. Even if they make a mistake, correcting it much quicker.
You use the word blame. Who is accountable? Like, who pays for these crimes in order for the public to regain trust, or for a company or the government to establish trust with the populace? Presumably, there needs to be some outcome for these failures.
The outcome the trust ultimately has to be with the government. But the government then, on its part, has to create accountability for all people. We have a certain consequence if we, drive under the influence, if we do something that's reckless, that's harmful to people. So we have traffic laws. I mean, so most people accept that. We want those laws and we want them enforced, and that allows us to trust the roads, that kind of thing. If you want to look the word trust. So it's trustworthy to go on the road, the way they'll construct the road, the way they'll enforce speed limits or other traffic laws, we think will slap somebody who drives under the influence with enough consequences that people might stop back, or together with campaign, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, all of that, setting the limits for what's drunk driving, all of those details that go into it. Now, when you come to corporations with a lot of power, again, is the government able and willing to set the right rules and create the right consequences? What I think you see, and why there is a lot of public anger, is, why executives didn't go to jail after the financial crisis, that kind of thing. It was lawful, or they weren't personally intending to harm, they just did this and the other thing. So it is right now what I'm actually interested in, because I sort of dug all the way to basic law enforcement. And so it is a question. If you have a big organization, including a government organization, that acts through many people. How can you make them collectively and individually accountable to the people whose lives they're impact? So the ultimate price of a bad system falls on the public. And, Boeing was just another example. So there's a book on Boeing called Flying Blind. And it describes the entire history of the corporation and how it came to be that they basically told the FAA that the 737 MAX doesn't require pilot training, even as they knew that they gave some kind of a software fix that if pilots were not familiar with, might get the planes to do what two planes did do. And they were blaming pilots after the first crash, only to be faced with a second crash very shortly after in the very same manner. Finally, there's a crash, a plane crash, dead bodies, total 346 dead, and black boxes, and all of a sudden the details emerged of what they did. And then, they get pursued by the Department of Justice for defrauding the FAA. Well, the FAA, the Federal Aviation Authority, was willingly, letting them.
They were complicit in some degree.
Completely. So now they're defrauded the FAA and they slap a little bit of a fine on them. They obviously have enormous financial harm from all these planes being grounded and all these airlines and victims needing compensation. Okay, well, you took a risk, you endangered these people, and it didn't work out. They weren't even prosecuted for fraud. They had a deferred prosecution agreement. And then, very recently, they actually pleaded guilty because then more whistleblowers came and a door flew off and other safety concerns came about. And so now the government comes after the fact and after the harm was done. And there's often a huge harm that already happened, some of which you can't even undo when people die or become addicted. And the harm is really unbelievable.
Anat, you mentioned to me in an earlier conversation that your beliefs were shattered when the financial crisis hit. So describe for a moment what your beliefs were before that, how they changed, and how that has inspired your work since then.
Yes, so I was just your run-of-the-mill finance professor, teaching corporate finance, some stuff to PhDs, some to MBAs. And in my world, I started teaching, saying to the students how wonderful the financial system is. So in my playbook of finance, as I was introducing the subject and then teaching them the math and how to price this or that or how to make investment decisions, there wasn't supposed to be a financial crisis. Like this was just this wonderful market that was doing all these wonderful things for society and enabling some people to invest, other people to get funding, spreading the risk around, governing what should be invested in and shouldn't be investing in, managing investments over time. It was a wonderful, wonderful system that allowed innovations and growth and savings and all this good stuff that it was doing. You could borrow money, you can lend money or invest, and everything was great about this system. So the financial crisis was a shock because it wasn't in my possibilities. I assumed that the rules did work. I didn't even look there. I didn't know much about banking specifically, but it was the banks, but also others, GM, AIG, that suddenly were being bailed out, that wasn't supposed to happen. These markets were supposed to work. So why does the government need to come in and, prevent default on some obligation that some company made, because otherwise the thing will melt down and all of it will collapse. And then at the other end of it are people who were being lent money to buy houses, probably too much lending, money they oftentimes couldn't pay back unless the housing prices kept going up and up and up. And then the housing prices did go down. And then many of these people couldn't pay. And then there was an enormous housing crisis and people lost their homes, on and on.
A cascading effect. Yeah.
Somehow the financial system came to an implosion and there were real elements, despite the bailouts of a great recession, unemployment, all of that after that. What was going on? So as a finance professor, I can tell you the tools that I knew did not give me the answer. The answer, as I looked for an answer of what happened, it became clear early on that the rules were bad and really bad and badly designed and all of that. And that was not that hard to find out. What was hard was actually getting through with saying that. It was really incredibly sobering that way, to spend a lot of time as a Stanford academic with some credibility, somehow saying simple things about corporate finance as applied to banking became, so crazy. And it was so hard to get through because there were so many things people were told to believe, or maybe did believe, that they preferred to believe, and they wouldn't really listen to you. So that was very, very difficult experience.
So what's the answer to all of this, Anat? I mean, in a time when government itself seems dysfunctional, we can barely pass a budget bill every year, how do we attack this problem?
There's no choice but to try to make the government better. I mean, I just don't see any other way, because how do we speak about collective anything? I mean, we can devolve back into tribes and religions and whatever happened. We organized ourselves around nation states, and there's all sorts of international relations and state actors everywhere. There are violent wars. We thought that was over, and now we see that it's not over. So, there's nothing to do but to try to have good governments. I think in the famous writings of the U.S. Federalist paper, it said, if men were angels, we wouldn't need government. And then in the Constitution of the United States, they really constrained the government a lot. And so it said the big challenge is to first give the government power to govern, enough power, and then to force it to constrain itself. So the U.S. Constitution did a lot to constrain the government, but then the government here kind of failed to constrain the institutions in the private sector that they've allowed to create. And I mean, that's how I see it in the U.S. and in a lot of other developed countries right now. And I think that once you understand, you kind of know what to do. I just think a lot of people don't fully understand a lot of the things. Like, I still keep learning about how it works, but I got to the point where I don't make assumptions anymore.
Yeah.
I just want to really see what is going on. And I don't believe people, but I just want to know the truth. So, I called this in the book. We ended up, I was telling my co-author, how can we possibly end this book? In the first edition, we ended with saying, we just need political will. And it's like, oh, good luck finding political will to reform the financial system. And I'm like, we can't just leave people depressed. So we ended with a sort of plea we thought it was very clever, I do think it's clever, not to speak truth to power, but to empower truth. So my solution is, truth. Can you look for truth? That means investigative reporters, whistleblowers, In other words, seek truth.
Right.
Start there. From truth, other things good can come out. While you're not looking at the reality, bad things can prevail. So that's kind of my ultimate answer. It's a big challenge, but it's a North Star.
As Anat says, a functioning democracy depends on trust and accountability. So if we want a democracy worthy of our trust, then we need to empower truth seekers. If Then is a podcast from Stanford Graduate School of Business. I'm your host, Kevin Kuhl. Our show is written and produced by Making Room and the content and design team at the GSB. Our managing producers are Jenny Luna and Elizabeth Wylezik-Stern. Executive producers are Sorrel Husbands-Denholtz and Jim Colgan. Sound design and additional production support by Mumble Media. For more on our faculty and their research, find Stanford GSB online at gsb.stanford.edu or on social media at Stanford GSB. If you enjoyed today's conversation, consider sharing it with a friend or colleague. And remember to subscribe to If Then wherever you get your podcasts, or leave us a review. It really helps other listeners find the show. We'd also love to hear from you. Is there a subject you'd like us to cover? Something that sparked your curiosity? Or a story or perspective that you'd like to share? Email us at ifthenpod@stanford.edu. That's ifthenpod@stanford.edu. Thanks for listening. We'll be back with another episode soon.